Face mask mandates are back in China, linked to public spaces, transportation, and even inside elevators. It's the latest prevention measure as a mysterious pneumonia keeps hospitals overwhelmed. What's the price tag for defecting from Taiwan to China? For one Army pilot, the offer totals $15 million, getting offered the sum to fly an American-made aircraft into the hands of the communist regime. Calls for freedom sounds on Human Rights Day.
Human rights supersede state sovereignty.
More on the latest voices of dissent against the Chinese Communist Party. And China's new trade rules on Shanghai, pushing the city to open up. In the wake of a tightening political system, how will foreign investors respond? What do you think? Let us know below and subscribe if you haven't already. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we continue, as you may know, our channel's been hit by social media censorship. On top of being demonetized for about 3 years, we've also seen strange issues like viewers subscribing to our channel, then finding they've been unsubscribed. Help support us by sharing our content with friends and family and consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-focus. Your viewership helps make our show possible. Thanks for watching. An update on China's illness outbreak. Face mask mandates are back for some public spaces in the country. China's CDC issued a new guideline over the weekend, directing people to wear masks to prevent infectious respiratory diseases. The notice ordered areas across the country to carefully implement it. Where are Chinese citizens being asked to wear masks? First, when patients infected with infectious respiratory diseases are within 3 feet of others. COVID-19 tops the list of diseases mentioned in the guideline. The mask requirement also extends to hospitals, nursing homes, welfare institutions, kindergartens, and schools. While not strictly required, the notice also recommends that people wear masks on public transportation, like while on planes, trains, ships, buses, or the subway. That suggestion carried over to supermarkets, movie theaters, bus stations, and even inside elevators. The new guideline comes as hospitals across China remain overwhelmed. Residents told us that symptoms of the current outbreak appear similar to those from 1 year ago, when Chinese authorities abruptly lifted strict COVID-19 lockdowns. They add that this time, the symptoms appear more serious, and people are getting infected repeatedly within a short time. To protect their identities, we distorted their voices.
I had a fever twice. My daughter also had a fever twice. My grandson 3 times, all high fevers. Even with antipyretics, that could not be relieved.
It is quite common right now that about 60 to 70% people are infected. Only half of the children still go to school. Some of them have been sick for a month, with relatively severe symptoms. Just like the one after the opening up 1 year ago. People had a fever and they lasted for a long time. After recovering, the illness recurred.
It's very serious. Many children have gone to the hospital. There's no specific medicine to cure it. In some classes, there are only 2 or 3 students who aren't sick. Almost all of them are staying home.
After lifting lockdown measures, Chinese hospitals stopped mass testing people for the CCP virus, which causes COVID-19. The lack of testing means no direct proof from China that COVID-19 is behind the new outbreak. A doctor from the UK believes the mystery pneumonia sweeping China is another COVID-like virus. He says Western countries don't need to panic. Despite the outbreak, China has announced it will discount entry visa fees for travelers from over a dozen countries starting Monday. It's also extending the measure until the end of next year. Over the last 2 weeks, Beijing has relaxed entry visa policies covering hundreds of millions of people across nearly 24 countries. A $15 million offer to defect from Taiwan to Communist China. Prosecutors say Beijing offered a Taiwanese army pilot the money in exchange for an American-made helicopter. The pilot was directed to fly the transport aircraft over the unofficial border between Taiwan and mainland China and landed on a Chinese military aircraft carrier, all during a Chinese military drill near the island. Beijing intelligence officials reportedly approached the pilot last summer through a retired Taiwanese Army officer. The pilot declined the original offer, around $6,000 a month, and the promise that China would evacuate his family in the event of a Chinese invasion. He later accepted when the offer was raised to $15 million. Taiwanese authorities arrested the pilot and former officer before the plan was carried out. The indictment comes alongside a Chinese naval drill Monday in the Taiwan Strait, featuring Beijing's Shandong aircraft carrier. The island is preparing for parliamentary and presidential elections next month. China has been accused of trying to interfere. A call to action on the 75th anniversary of Human Rights Day. The UN declaration was made to prevent crimes against humanity after the atrocities and Holocaust of World War II. Doctors and experts over the weekend sounded the alarm over failures to put principles into action in countries like China. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has more.
Washington-based medical ethics advocacy group Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting hosted an international roundtable Sunday to focus on challenges putting the principles of universal human rights into action and the horrific crimes of the CCP.
All nations and individuals have to reckon with the realities of the Holocaust. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights represented the gap between a humanitarian ideal and living up to it on the ground.
75 years after the declaration, the panel suggests the international community pause and reflect on who's had their rights trampled on and who's been left behind. Executive director of the group, Dr. Torsten Trey, told NTD it's important to understand that the CCP's forced organ harvesting is not about organ trafficking, it's about killing people to harvest their organs.
And that's a phenomenon that we only have seen in China.
Trey says organ transplants in China spiked exponentially after 1999 when the persecution of Falun Gong started. Chinese authorities estimated at the time that up to 100 million people were practicing Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa.
But it was actually only in 2006 when we learned from whistleblowers that the prisoners of conscience, Falun Gong practitioners, were the main source of for forced organ harvesting.
Since then, Trey says the CCP has tried to suppress and destroy Falun Gong, with forced organ harvesting and persecution being the regime's ultimate solution. He says the CCP has built a sophisticated network of influence to cover its crimes, and uses blatant economic pressure and political threats, along with propaganda, to spread a false representation of what Falun Gong is.
They practice Buddhist Qigong, and they follow the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance.
The doctor says the best thing to do to have an impact is simply break the silence.
So if everyone takes a moment to understand what Falun Gong is about, that Falun Gong is about truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, things that we could use very well in these times, if we learn about this and then speak about it, and also understand about the forced organ harvesting and speak about the forced organ harvesting, we basically lift the concealed eradication to the daylight and thus defeat the purpose.
An independent people's tribunal in London concluded in 2019 that forced organ harvesting in China has taken place on a significant scale for years, with detained Falun Gong practitioners as the primary source. The persecution in China continues today. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
Also marking Human Rights Day over the weekend, a group of activists gathered in the heart of Beijing.
Today is December 10th, 2023, World Human Rights Day, and we human rights defenders are lining up at the entrance of the State Bureau for letters and calls of the Chinese Communist Party. Human rights supersedes state sovereignty. Defending human rights is an act of patriotism.
Beijing set up the Bureau of Letters and Calls to address civilian complaints. But reports reveal citizens often risk their lives to petition for justice before authorities. Many of them allegedly detained in state-backed black jails before even reaching Beijing with their grievances. Some petitioners told NTD that Beijing is strengthening its clampdown.
The Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal is to eliminate dissidents, and now is even more resolute in doing so. The Constitution, laws, or regulations claim to support human rights. They're deceptive, open lies.
We are living in constant terror with no assurance of our safety or property. You never know when you'll be beaten to death. The bureau leader has openly said, even if you are beaten to death, so what?
Human rights group Safeguard Defenders reports increased use of collective punishment by Beijing against activists' loved ones. The new report identified at least 50 such cases from 2015 to 2022. Tactics involved detention, home eviction, and harassment. 3 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong were arrested over the weekend. That's amid Beijing's latest electoral overhaul, making sure that only candidates loyal to the communist regime can hold office on the island. Because of it, the city is witnessing its lowest voter turnout in decades. Here's more.
Hong Kong began its Patriots-only district election on Sunday. It has marginalized former popular opposition figures in the city amid a national security clampdown. 3 pro-democracy activists from the League of Social Democrats were arrested just before voting began. The group had planned to protest against the birdcage election that it said lacked any democratic scope. Regulations introduced in July slashed the directly elected district council seats by nearly 80% from 4 years ago. All candidates must also undergo national security background checks and secure nomination. The regulation changes further narrow electoral freedoms in the former British colony. It returned to Chinese rule in 1997. The crackdown under a 2020 China-imposed national security law has led to arrests of former district councillors and the disbandment of major opposition parties. Kenneth Chan is a political scientist at Hong Kong Baptist University and a former pro-democracy lawmaker.
What they're doing now is the installation of the so-called Patriots-only governance structure against the backdrop of the imposition of the national security law since mid-2020. So I'm afraid democracy is off the agenda.
Some Western governments say the China-imposed national security law has been used to crack down on dissent. For weeks, the major pro-Beijing and pro-government parties have been out in force campaigning in a bid to boost turnout, as some observers see large numbers spanning the polls.
Now shifting gears, a lineup of short headlines from Asia Pacific. Collisions causing maneuvers in the South China Sea. The Philippines is reporting more Chinese Coast Guard aggression, saying its civilian supply vessels were targeted with water cannons and that the Chinese ships rammed one of the Philippine boats.
It's a serious escalation on the part of the agents of the People's Republic of China. The use of water cannons numerous times, long-range acoustic devices, as well as dangerous and unsafe maneuvers is completely unacceptable.
The Chinese Coast Guard said the Philippine ships illegally intruded into Chinese waters. Beijing claims virtually all of the South China Sea as Chinese territory, despite an international tribunal ruling otherwise. About 1/3 of global shipping passes through the waterway. Moving to Oceania, on Monday, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea said his nation is not in talks with China on security. The Pacific Island nation just signed a security agreement with neighboring Australia last week. Papua New Guinea is currently discussing a free trade agreement with China. Over in South Korea, President Yoon Suk-yeol is on his way to the Netherlands for a state visit. He'll be discussing cooperation on semiconductors and a potential chip alliance. South Korea and the Netherlands are both key players in the global microchip sector. The Netherlands has joined the U.S. and Japan in restricting chip exports to China. Staying on the Korean peninsula, a look at the conditions of North Korean defectors. A South Korean human rights group says up to 600 North Koreans have vanished after China forcibly deported them recently. The group said China carried out the largest mass deportation of North Korean defectors in years on October 9th. The organization warned the defectors could face imprisonment, torture, sexual violence, and execution in North Korea. China's overseas influence efforts ramping up through a new trade plan. The country's state council is pushing to develop the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. It would focus on international trade standards and seek to increase cross-border trade. The announcement first went public last Friday, along with a package of new economic measures. But the question remains, will the rest of the world trust the Chinese regime?
It's impossible to really reform because China holds strict political controls and they're getting even more strict. The CCP prioritizes so-called authoritarian security. As long as this is in place, everything else is meaningless. For foreign companies, the anti-espionage law would basically scare everyone away.
Cai Shenquan is a writer and commentator specializing on China's economy. He said that the Chinese Communist Party is granting limited flexibility only to Beijing and Shanghai, adding that the two are still under the regime's strict controls. Some say Beijing envisions Shanghai as the next Hong Kong. The city used to be a significant hub for Asia's finance and economy, but investors have been pulling out of Hong Kong ever since the CCP tightened its political control of the region. The CCP imposed a national security law in Hong Kong 3 years ago. The rule gives the party greater power to control the city, far more than under the previous system. Because of the new law, authorities can now easily target foreign firms, often citing vague reasons like national security concerns. Former President Trump ended Washington's special trade status for Hong Kong in 2020. Biden has also warned American companies to reconsider investing or operating in the region. The European and U.S. Chambers of Commerce reported that 25% and 40% of their companies, respectively, are leaving Hong Kong. To combat it, Beijing is working to align Shanghai's trade zone with international standards. An expert says in order to achieve that,
the Chinese Communist Party would need to withdraw from Shanghai, establish an elected government, and have experts lead economic policies. This is not achievable.
Liang Shaohua was a lawyer in China. He now lives in Canada.
That's over today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for more than 2 years. If you'd like to support us, subscribe to our partner platform, Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes. Here's what to look out for in our second half. More tension in the South China Sea. The Philippines and China accusing each other of dangerous collision-causing maneuvers. The Philippine Coast Guard reports damage, while China claims intrusion in the contested waters. Who's really responsible, and why should America care? We discuss with Grant Newsham, retired Marine Colonel and author of When China Attacks. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.